Back, while the Israel-Hamas ceasefire has received mixed reactions from all over the world, with many welcoming the ceasefire, there are some who are calling for Israel to be held responsible for their bombardment of Gaza. A ceasefire came into force in the Gaza Strip after Egypt and Qatar brokered an agreement between Israel and Hamas to halt 11 days of bloodshed. Over 230 Palestinians died, including 65 children in Gaza. And about 12 to 13 people in Israel, we're hearing reports. Now, to discuss the historical context of Israel-Palestine conflict, I'm now joined by Olga Meshwe-Washington, who is the CEO of DAISY, and Thapelo Ahmed, the chairperson of Al-Jama, who is based here in Gauteng, and he joins me in studio. Thapelo, perhaps let me start with you. Now, you recently marched to the US Consulate in protest of the violence coming out of the Middle East, particularly in the Gaza regions. Talk to us about what your demands were, to the US Consulate, and what's your reaction overall to the recent conflict in that region?
Thank you very much. Ours is very simple. We are advocating for the ceasefire, and we are advocating for giving back the land that has been taken unjustly to the children of Palestine by a few group of Zionists, which appears to seduce the faith-based people with the notion that they make it appear as if it is religious struggle. But it has nothing to do with religion. It is an issue of humanity, and we would always advocate for human justice. I, as a South African who understands what apartheid is, from the history that we just came from, the former president Nelson Mandela said, South Africa will never be liberated until Palestine is liberated. So the issues are cross-cutting. It's a lived experience, and we understand what apartheid stands for. So why we went to the US Consulate, we had submitted those demands to say, the Consular General has to hand over our memorandum to Joe Biden. And we know that the USA has been directly contributing on sponsoring that group of people who are Zionists, who are perpetuating violence against innocent women and children.
All right, thanks for that. Olga, perhaps let me bring you in. Your organization supports Israel. What's your view about the ongoing violence in the Middle East? I'm particularly interested in your thoughts on the recent Human Rights Watch report describing the conflict as systemic oppression by the Israeli government against the Palestinian people, going as far as likening it to apartheid. And I'm sure you've heard Thapelo echoing the same sentiments. What's your take?
Well, thank you very much for having me, Nati. So DAISY International, first of all, believes in truth. That is why we are here. We're here to educate. We're here to give people the correct information. The whole notion that Israel is an apartheid state is an absolute lie. It's interesting that you also bring up the Human Rights Watch report. In the introduction of that report, they go so far as to even explain the fact that in their description of how Israel is an apartheid state, they are expanding the definition. So there already is an admission that the apartheid that we knew, that Thapelo even references, is not what is taking place in Israel. I would like to know from Thapelo if he's been to Israel. I've been to Israel more than 5 times. And what we see on the ground, what we see happening both to the Palestinian people as well as to the Israelis, the Jews, the Arabs, does not exist in Israel. We are definitely not just about religion, as Thapelo alluded to. This is definitely an issue of humanity. This is definitely an issue of truth. It is an issue of justice. Now, what is interesting, though, is that when we talk about these elements, what we should be doing is now referencing Hamas. If we really care about humanity, if we really care about truth and justice, we need to see from whom the Palestinian people need liberation, like Thapelo referenced former President Nelson Mandela saying. They need liberation from Hamas. Those are the true oppressors. You asked me with regards to the recent violence that happened in the Middle East. So first of all, the antagonists were not Israel. They were rioters, and then ultimately Hamas, who started to bombard Israel with rockets. In 11 days, over 4,000 rockets were sent from Gaza by Hamas into Israel. And there was at least 1 in every 7 of those rockets that fell on innocent Palestinian people. If you do the math, that's 600 rockets that fell on innocent Palestinian people themselves who then died. Also, lastly, on this point, Hamas, when it issues, or rather when it launches these rockets, it doesn't launch these rockets in places where there will be no casualties. It launches these rockets, this is documented even by the UN, it launches these rockets in densely populated civilian areas. So it uses the Palestinian people as human shields. If we want to speak about justice, we need to be calling Hamas to account.
Perhaps, Olga, let me stay with you, especially on the comments that you're making. The Human Rights Watch report, though, has also mentioned that on numerous occasions in the past, they've documented those human rights abuses from, Hamas and the Palestinian Authority. Don't you think that those who accuse Israel of systemic violence against the Palestinians have a point in that they're saying that this violence is a form of oppression and perhaps an intent to maintain that system of violence and power by Israel?
Well, what I would like to know is, just because you call something something doesn't make it. I can take an orange and call it an apple. That doesn't make that an apple. It's an orange. So truth needs to be established. What is happening on the ground? What I would love to know is, give me examples of the systemic oppression that is happening in Israel. Oftentimes people talk about the fact that there is this blockade between the borders of Gaza as well as Israel, that there is no humanitarian aid that is allowed into Israel, from Israel rather, into Gaza. And that's an absolute lie. One only needed to have seen a few days ago where there was humanitarian aid sent by Israel on the ground into Gaza, despite the fact that there was war. But then what happens? Those very humanitarian aid trucks, they were bombarded. So also the Human Rights Watch organization, unfortunately, is also known for its anti-bias against Israel. I will repeat it again. Just because people say something is, does not make it the reality on the case. I'm very happy to entertain true examples of systemic oppression. I've been to Israel. My father's been to Israel close on 20 times. There are documentations by lawyers in Europe across the world that can attest to the fact that this notion that Israel is an apartheid state is a lie factually.
Thapelo, are you surprised at all, given this recent violence, that it seems like the global rhetoric around this conflict is somewhat changing? I mean, we've seen even in international media space that the tonality and the language is changing, with some people on the ground even going as far as saying that they don't blame the Palestinians, for retaliating and defending themselves to that point. But perhaps let's talk about that shift. Do you see that more and more of the international community is in support of, firstly, peace, and secondly, for Israel to stop its what they call systemic violence and oppression against the Palestinian people? And of course, taking into consideration what Olga is saying now, to say that Hamas is using Palestinian people as human shields.
Thank you for bringing that on the table. First, I would like to urge to Olga Meshwe and her father to say, out of all the people in the world, it is only her and her father who doesn't perceive this to be apartheid, who doesn't perceive this to be inhumane. DERCO just declared as well, not long ago, I think a couple of days, to say Israeli is a state of apartheid. Not only now, but even the Human Rights Commission, the UN has declared as well. So I don't understand when she's saying this is not apartheid. It depends on what lenses is she perceiving the truth, what the truth is. History is going to judge. I would also urge that they must be on the safe side of the history, starting from now. So we are part of the community. And the community that we are part of, it's the one that you are making reference to, say it's a global community. Everyone in the world sees what's happening. When there was apartheid in South Africa, everyone in the world, they saw and they pushed the apartheid regime from South Africa for us to see the lighter of the day. So it is the same thing that we are doing, pledging solidarity for the children of Palestine as an international community, to say they should put these atrocities to an end, and they should also cease fire, because innocent children are dying. Hamas is there to defend. what is duly right. If there's justice and injustice, you can never take the middle path. If you are for the middle path, that would mean you have sided with the side of the oppressor, which is injustice. So that's the view on the table.
Do you believe, though, that Hamas, I mean, it's been said in some quarters, that they've also got their own personal agenda, and at some point they have used Palestinian civilians as human shields?
No, I don't believe. Look, let me put it this way. We had movements in South Africa. One of the movements was the PAC or the ANC, for argument's sake, right? I remember Mama Winnie, the late Mama Winnie, when she was advocating for us to defend ourselves. So much so, she uttered that you have a matchbox, right? You can even use that matchbox to fight the giant. So Hamas, it's not using Palestinians as a human shield to advance a certain agenda. These people are all oppressed, right? So there isn't any other system that is conducive for them to advocate for their plight and defend. So Hamas is the only organization that might have minimum required resources to defend the land that has been taken away from the Palestinians.
All right, Thapelo, I want you to hold that thought. We'll come back to you in a moment. We'll continue with this conversation, zoning in on what is happening. Welcome back, and thanks so much for staying with us. Well, I am in conversation about the Israeli-Palestine conflict, and I have two guests with me this afternoon. I'm joined by Olga Meshe-Washington, who is the CEO of DAISY, and Thapelo Ahmed, who is in studio with me this afternoon, and he's a chairperson of Al-Jama'ah. Well, Olga, perhaps let's go back to you. So let's look at the systemic issues that we spoke about earlier, particularly, you know, the comments that you and Thapelo have made earlier on. We know that this is a temporary escalation in violence. So looking at that, I mean, a lot of analysts are saying that temporary violence should not be overshadowed by the severe systemic discrimination in property rights, for example, freedom of movement, life of Palestinians, and that the life of Palestinian people is significantly different to that of a Jewish Israeli, for instance. You've mentioned that you've been to Israel. You understand how that country sees and treats its people. So is this perhaps not a short-termism kind of approach from your end in terms of what we should be talking about, which is real systemic issues and real human rights issues that are happening here?
Well, we are talking about real human rights issues. That's why we do what we do. But before I respond to your question, if I could please respond to what Thapelo said before the break. You know, if myself and the Reverend and Daisy are amongst a group of over 10,000 people who gathered in 2014, black and white of various religions, to show solidarity and support for Israel. That's what happened in 2014. If we are counted amongst the likes of Martin Luther King here in the United States, who recognized Israel as a democracy, we have got Pan-African fathers like Jomo Kenyatta as well as Kwame Nkrumah. They recognized Israel not as an apartheid state, not having oppression towards the Palestinian people, but actually something that we could aspire to. Then I'm okay with being put amongst those people. I would like to know that when we're talking about oppression in relation to the Palestinian people, why are we not speaking on their behalf? Why did nobody say anything when in 2019 the Palestinian people in Gaza got onto the streets as part of a protest that they called Right to Live, protesting against the oppression that Hamas was having over them? Why has there been no noise about that if we are talking about true justice? Now, when you talk about systemic oppression, many people like to mention of the fact of how Palestinian people live in the West Bank and or in Gaza versus in Israel proper. But what they forget to tell, and most times deliberately they forget to do this, is that there are different government or authorities that rule in those lands. In the West Bank, we have the Palestinian Authority. We have Fatah. There is a president, Mahmoud Abbas, who was elected in 2005 and to this day has not had re-elections. A couple of weeks ago, he postponed the elections. He was elected in 2005 for a term of 4 years. Why is nobody talking about how the Palestinian people living in the West Bank have been disenfranchised from their right to vote? 4 years, and we're now going on 16 years and they have not had elections. Again, in Gaza, you want to talk about free speech? There is no such thing as free speech. I encourage people that are watching this particular interview, as well as my colleague Tapelo, to look up the likes of Khalid Abu Tome, as well as Basim Eid, Arabs, Palestinian Arabs, who are human rights activists that are telling the truth about what the Palestinian people are actually going through on the ground. So this whole notion of oppression and lower quality of life, yes, absolutely, that exists. But we need to start calling out why it exists and whose fault it is. And it is not Israel's. Closing and last on this particular point, Israel is not perfect. But show me a country that is perfect. If we stop using Israel as a scapegoat to blame Israel for everything that is wrong regarding the Palestinian people, it is only then that we will start to see the lives of the Palestinians being improved.
All right, Olga, just correct me if I'm incorrect. I'm hearing you correctly saying that you do not think that Israel is in any way to blame for oppressing the Palestinian people, and it's not to blame for the systemic violence that we are seeing not only just recently, but over the years.
Well, I ask you again, what is the systemic violence that Israel is supposedly doing? Does Israel retaliate? Absolutely, Israel retaliates. But show me a country that does not have the right to defend its people. People often talk about how in 1967, that's when the uprising started, with Israel retaliating or oppressing the Palestinian people. Or they even talk about in 1948 when the state of Israel was established. But they don't talk about in 1929, where there were Jewish villages that were massacred by Arabs. They don't talk about wars that occurred before even the establishment of the state of Israel, where Israel was the country, or rather the people, that was under attack. They don't even talk about the fact that Hamas's charter, its founding document, its governing document, talks about the fact that Israel not only has no right to exist, but that every single Jew must be killed. So if you want to talk about systemic violence and incitement of violence, again, it's not on the side of Israel, it's on the side of the Palestinians as well as the Palestinian Authority. Please give me an example of systemic violence and systemic oppression that is being inputted on the Palestinian people over the years.
Tapelo, when you listen to what Olga is saying and you look at, the current infighting that we've just recently seen, and we see that over 200 people, Palestinians, as a matter of fact, have died, and these are mostly civilians, and children being amongst those. And you look at, just the context of oppression as it speaks to, power and those levels of balance. What are your views in terms of, Hamas being the instigators and Israel protecting its rights?
The views that Hamas is the instigators, it's a wrong view. It is the same view as the apartheid government, where it perceived the ANC to be a terrorist organization, for argument's sake. As I'm making reference to a liberation movement. It's the closest citation that I would gather. Not that I'm advocating for the ANC in particular, but because we acknowledge the changes that were there at the time. So you are a field nigger, you are a house nigger. We are all niggers at the end of the day. We shouldn't forget where we come from as people. We shouldn't protect an interest of the master at the expense of innocent children, at the expense of innocent female, where GBV, even in South Africa, it's still a problem to date, gender-based violence against women and children. So it is problemsome for us to even advocate for a system that is perpetuating all inhumane conditions to the innocent children who do not know. It's not just civilians, but innocent children. Apartheid is not the color of the skin or ethnicity, but it stems from algorithm, where the systems are put in place to protect the few. This is why in South Africa in particular, if you live in the south of Johannesburg, every day without failure in the morning, there's traffic going to the north. Every day without failure in the evening from 3 o'clock, there's traffic going to the south. So it is the very same system which was placed by apartheid to exclude people from participating, from being dignified, from being perceived as human enough So it is completely wrong to you know, if in as much as someone would say there are people who are Jewish who would be for Palestine. At times it goes to an extent where those elite Jewish, they are just paternalistic. It's just their paternal instincts that are kicking in to say when your child is crying and the mother was reprimanding them, as a father you'd embrace the child to comfort them, but you know that you are not for the cause. So it's people like Olga, the people like Reverend, who misconstrue the reality on the ground.
Olga, I know you've responded partly to what Thapelo has been saying in as far as referencing your reality on the ground. You said that your organization tries and demystifies, just some of the untruths that are out there about Israel. Now, you base mostly some of your comments and your beliefs in the fact that you've been to Israel and you've witnessed firsthand what goes there. So tell us a little bit about what are some of these mistruths that that you are trying to demystify and you're trying to teach the youth as part of your organization.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak to that. Just very briefly again, I do need to respond to Thapelo. It's very interesting that when people unfortunately run out of, I assume, evidence to substantiate their point, they then have to resort to insults, which is what he's done in relation to me as well as my father. But it's also interesting when you hear how he defined apartheid. He went on and he included the term algorithm. So he's just redefined the term apartheid to try and make it fit the narrative that he as well as his organization purports. And that's something that we see happening across the world all the time. But to come specifically to the work that Daisy does, we don't see ourselves as servants of these masters and we have to then follow whatever Israel says and whatever the Jews say. As Africans, we teach the reality of what Israel and a friend with Israel has done for the African continent and what it will do. Do you know that in the 1950s and the 1960s, when many of the African nations were coming out of colonization, they were getting their liberty, it was Jews, it was Israel that came and helped African nations. You can go to Zambia, you can go to Ethiopia, you can go to Uganda, you can go to Ghana. There are roads, hospitals, education systems, security systems that Israel came to help Africa build. That is why we do what we do, to encourage our both students as well as people to say, Israel is a true friend that can help Africa. If you look at the developments that have come out of Israel, Israel is known as a startup nation of the world. Innovation from the technology that we use. In South Africa, we need help from on a medical front in relation to circumcision. Israel has a solution. We need help in relation to water. Israel has a solution.
Olga, I'm going to have to ask us to wrap this conversation very quickly. Perhaps let me get your last words in. I mean, the World Health Organization and the Red Cross have said that the latest conflict has caused the worst destruction they've ever seen and that it will take years to rebuild. So as a last, parting shot from your side, what are some of the long-term solutions that are needed, though, to resolve the Middle East conflict? I mean, you talked about humanity, but at the end of the day, Palestinian lives are being taken, civilians are being affected, children are dying from these conflicts.
100%. And it's not only Palestinian lives, but it's Jewish lives as well. We need to start telling Hamas, Islamic Jihad, the Palestinian Authority, and the rest of them to stop going for the Jewish people and wanting to kill them. If your governing documents say that you need to kill all the Jews, that you will not recognize them, that needs to stop. We need to start telling Hamas to stop using its people, its innocent children, as human shields when there is war. We need to start telling the truth that in Israel, more than 50% of Israelis are of a dark color skin. It's not just white people. The truth in Israel is the fact that it doesn't matter what your religion is, it doesn't matter what your ethnicity is, you have all access to all hospitals, you have access to vote, you have access to all forms of education. The truth needs to start to be told, and we need to start holding Hamas as well as its counterparts accountable for what it is doing. Then only will we start to see peace happen in the Middle East.
Thapelo, as last words from you, final words from you, you've called on the U.S. government, to intervene. You've recently marched onto the US Consulate. What are the long-term solutions that are needed to resolve the conflict in the Middle East, especially when we are so divided in our thinking?
The long-term solution is to tell the U.S. to back off. We need to pose sanctions to U.S. together with the Israelis. We have the buying power as Africans So we need to sanction them in as much as they did to other African countries. So why did I say it is paternalistic for one to appear as if they are sympathetic? All the infrastructure that Olga is making reference to, it is not for the African interest, but it is for the interest of the few who are here to loot in our continent. So basically, the memorandum says the USA must advocate for Israeli to cease fire, and then they need to also advocate for Israeli to release the land that belongs to the children of Israel, of Palestine, my apologies. And they should stop killing innocent children and innocent female counterpart.
All right, I'm afraid we've run out of time, but thank you so much to you, Olga Mishwe-Washington, who is the CEO of Daisy, and Tapelo Ahmed, the chairperson of Al-Jama, for your time, just touching a little bit there on the situation in the Middle East. Well, we'll be back with more of your top stories straight after this.